as difficult as it is, as sometimes terrible as it is, as vulnerable as we feel, as complicated as it can be, weeping or crying is quite beautiful. Men especially, but not exclusively, we wouldn't want to say that, find it particularly difficult to cry. I know our Adam's apple bobs up and down as we swallow and crush and suppress our vulnerability and our delicacy and our tender beauty. And human beings do this. It's not just a gender-specific facet of life to suppress the realness of what we're experiencing. Whether knowing loss, whether we're at the end of relationships or jobs or just around other people's suffering or working hard as the people in our hospitals do. Whatever it is that brings us to our sense of being able to, or having to, have that kind of emotional release expressed. And we are blessed by that. Now, here I want to talk about the two different types of, or modes of crying. The weeping mode is something that happens to us. It is something that is done to us. In fact, were we to really look, inquire, we'd discover that life is done to us despite our plans and schemes of how it should be. You just look back and see if life has really ever gone the way you wanted it to, or whether things have, it's more been the case that life has turned up with an approximation of the way we thought it would be, yet often better than we thought it was going to be. But naturally the ego likes to take credit for such outcomes, but really if we really look. And of course we are conditioned by school, family, culture, time frame in history to inevitably leave the familial house and school with expectations on how life might be, with hopes and dreams. Some of these might come to pass, some of them perhaps not. Many of us, not all of us, many of us would know the experience of the demise of a relationship, certainly for younger people that fall in love. The end of such relationships, in those that do end, can be a very difficult experience. I myself, as a teenager, when I dated and courted, at the demise of relationships, which were somewhat inevitable given the immaturity with which I moved out into the world after the schooling and family teaching and the wisdom that was passed on to me, which was good, but wasn't really adequate in practical terms. Also, the loss of a parent significantly inhibited that, particularly my mother. So you can imagine the version of will that went into relationships as a younger man, a very compulsive desire to find and keep love by all means and measures, led to some very unhealthy relationships. They're pretty unhealthy because I was in them. But to be fair, it was just that innate desire to be loved that we all have. But yet, at the end of those, I would be distraught. I would be re-experiencing the loss of a mother, or the loss of feminine energy in my life, and consequently, I would be re-experiencing a degree of trauma and difficulty that would bring me to necessarily feel like I had to suppress the upset that I was going through, and this led to finding comfort in other ways, self-soothing by often destructive ways. But there would be a lot of crying. There was a lot of tears within me, but fundamentally I would be in the crying mode, which is that a form of weeping or crying or shedding tears that fall from the ego, that fall from the collapse of a program of where I thought happiness might be found, or my current direction in life would be scuppered and come to an abrasive halt. And then the direction of life would have to go in take another route. And of course, for the ego, it can't control what that's going to look like. This is where our defense mechanisms arise. We are suddenly confronted with the idea that our life is no longer going in this direction. It's going to go in the direction of not being that direction, whatever that might look like. And so there's a lot to defend in that for the ego, its own fragility, its own sense of inadequacy, and in the end, finally, its own illusory nature, that there really isn't an ego. There's just the presence of the moment, the here and now, and these thoughts and a narrative about who I think I am in the moment. When we reduce it right down, anyway, that's what we find, that there's just spontaneous living. But without the recognition of that, without the understanding of that, without the awareness of the self or the awareness of the separate self, there's frequent collapses and disappointments and small deaths, and the inability to control that and to hold that tension and to be open, and of course then to be exposed. So there was crying, but for me, not a lot of crying even. I'm not a natural crier, I'm not a natural weeper. The weeping mode, however, are those moments where we can be overwhelmed by nothing in particular. We can be so full of gratitude that we weep. We can be so full of unresolved stuff that it rounds on us, and weeping is the single tear that first drips out, that leads towards sobbing. Weeping is the healing mode. Weeping is the place of natural beauty. Weeping is time spent with beloveds, with people we adore, with animals, with nature. We even cry over good food, don't we, some of us? But it's something that happens to us. Crying is something that we're doing, or there's a doing to it, and weeping is something that we're not doing, it's being done to us. Again, just like all life is. There are three principal reasons, as I understand them, as I understand weeping, why this happens, why it's necessary for us to weep, be vulnerable and be open in such a way. One is to carry a message to other people. So we weep, it carries the message firstly to other people that I am vulnerable. If you choose to be here for me, it shows other people that we are vulnerable, and then if they want to, they can be there for us. It also teaches other people in that it's okay to be vulnerable, that we are perhaps safe enough around them, or trust them enough that's happening in their presence, and then they could be there for us, and that they could do the same. And so love manifests itself in such a way, and trust is built, one of the most significant components of love. The second benefit of weeping, the second gift or lesson or teaching of weeping, is so that it cleans our lens for life. We weep so that our lens for life is cleared. It's vulnerable, it's delicate, it's painful, we feel exposed. Yet afterwards, don't we feel better? Don't we just feel better? And we just feel clearer, and we can see with the sense of self, with the clearness, with the clarity that was eluding us as we became more and more overwhelmed by whatever it is that we've been suppressing, or whatever we've been carrying with us, whatever has been muted and causing unconscious or traumatic manifestations of suppressed stuff, which isn't good in the body, isn't good for the soul, and isn't good for mind. It's just not good to have stuff buried or hidden. We all carry some, and that's the work that's being done out, being muted out for us in the human experience. So the first reason for crying is to be vulnerable and to show others that we're vulnerable. The second reason for crying is so that we heal. And the third reason for crying is that it cleans our lens for life. And then in that, we're able to move forward and feel the wholeness that had eluded us up to that point. So let's not apologise for crying. Let's not apologise for weeping. let's allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to experience the world in such a way that we're able to love ourselves enough to feel our delicacies and our beauty.